Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. We apologize for the delay, but inshallah we'll get started with the next session. Wolves in sheep's clothing, engaging deviant ideologies. And alhamdulillah for this we have our guest scholar Mufti Abrar Mirza. Mufti Abrar Mirza is the vice president of Darul Hikmah and he is the principal of the part-time academy program. He holds authorizations in Arabic and Islamic sciences, and he has a specialization in ifta, in issuing legal verdicts, for which he trained under the Honorable Mufti Ibrahim Desai. He teaches a variety of Islamic law courses for the weekend academy at Darul Hikmah, and he also holds a degree in information systems. So without further ado, I'd like to call up Mufti Abrar.
الحمد لله الذي هدى والصلاة والسلام على عباده الذين اصطفى خصوصا على سيد الرسل وخاتم الأنبياء وعلى آله وصحبه الذين اجتبى أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وما نرسل المرسلين إلا مبشرين ومنذرين ويجادل الذين كفروا بالباطل ليدحضوا به الحق واتخذوا آيات وما أنذروا هزوا. Honorable ulama and elders, dear brothers and respected sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. First of all, after the hamd and the praise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, sending peace and blessings upon the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, I wanted to extend my gratitude towards Darul Salam, its staff and its volunteers for all the work that they have been doing and inshallah will continue to do for the rest of the program. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put barakah in it. This bayan is not based on any story. Some of the other bayans that have been spoken about or maybe spoken about inshallah in the rest of the program, they're based on certain stories, right? The story about the people of the Kahf, of the cave, the two brothers who had the gardens, the story of Musa alayhi salam and Khidr. Right? There are different stories, right? Dhul Qarnayn, for example. They may be different stories that a lot of the different bayans are based on. This bayan is not based on a story. Right? It's actually based on half an ayah. It's based on half an ayah from Surah Kahf, from verse number 56, and on the part about وَيُجَادِلُ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا بِالْبَاطِلِ لِيُدْحِضُوا بِهِ الْحَقِّ. It's just based on that. We'll talk about what the ayah means, inshallah. The nature of the topic and the speech is slightly academic, so it's not necessarily stories, but inshallah, it's still easy to understand. You can still grasp it, assuming somebody's kind of devoted and paying attention to it, inshallah. But at certain points in the bayan, I'll just stop and I'll just say, everyone understand? And I'll ask, if you don't understand, raise your hand, because people don't like raising their hands. So it's better if I say, if you don't understand, raise your hand, then that way no one raises their hands. Now, this talk has a very attractive and a very absolutely true title, which is Wolves in Sheep's Clothing, Engaging Deviant Ideologies. And I may alter that title slightly to say Understanding Deviant Ideologies, because understanding of the deviant ideologies has to come before we actually talk about engaging in them. And in order for us to safeguard our iman and our ideology, we have to first understand the ideology of others. We have to understand the false ideologies, but at the same time you have to be understanding of our own ideology as well. So before we talk about understanding the false ideologies, we should take a little bit of time and make sure that we first understand our ideology. And when I'm talking about understanding our ideology, I'm not talking about the fact that we believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we believe in the messengers of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that we believe in the books, and we believe in the angels, and that we believe in the day of judgment, and that we believe in qadr, it's good and it's evil. I'm not talking about basic aqaid, basic creed and basic beliefs. Alhamdulillah, we are aware of that. What I'm talking about understanding our ideology is understanding our mindset, our way of thinking, right? Our approach towards the deen. That's what I mean when I'm talking about our ideology. And in order to understand our approach towards the deen, we have to first start at the very basic of it and understand why are we in need of wahi, of divine revelation. That why was there need for us that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala send down wahi, send down divine revelation. Every single person has a natural need to understand why are they here on this earth? Why am I here? What is the purpose of my creation? Why am I in this dunya? That's the natural need, natural question that every single human being has. And it's possible perhaps that if a person thinks about it enough and looks into the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that person can come to this conclusion that yes, that there is a purpose to my life, and there is a supreme being. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in the Quran, إِنَّ فِي خَلْقِ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَاخْتِلَافِ اللَّيْلِ وَالنَّهَارِ لَآيَاتٍ لِأُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ الذين يذكرون الله قياما وقعودا وعلى جنوبهم ويتفكرون في خلق السماوات والأرض ربنا ما خلقت هذا باطلا سبحانك فقنا عذاب النار. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about those people who think in the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They think about the heavens, they think about the earth, they think about the changing of the day and night, and through that they understand that رَبَّنَا مَا خَلَقْتَ هَذَا بَاطِلًا, that we have a Lord and He has not created this in vain, that there's a purpose to this. And as Muslims, we know and we have that question answered about what is the purpose of my existence? Why am I in this dunya? Our question has been answered. We know that Allah SWT mentions وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ, that we know that Allah SWT mentions that I have not created human beings and I have not created jinn except that they worship me. We know our purpose for existence, and it's the worship of Allah SWT. Now, once a person recognizes that purpose, though, there's a natural need for that person to understand, how do I fulfill that purpose? That if there's a supreme being whom I'm supposed to worship, whom I'm supposed to please, then what is the method that I should go about it? That's the logical, natural next question a person has. And we have to understand that for a person to come to a conclusion on any matter, for a person to understand anything, there are three modes of understanding. The first mode of understanding something is your senses, your five senses. Your sense of sight, smell, hearing, touch, taste, right? Your five senses, that's one of the ways that you understand something. The second mode of understanding something is your logic, your intellect. Right? You think about something and you ponder over it and you come to a conclusion. The third mode of understanding something and knowing something is wahi, is divine revelation. Everything is understood by one of these three ways, either your senses or your intellect or wahi. Let's take an example of a knife. You have a knife. Now your senses will tell you that this is a sharp object. Your sight, your touch will tell you this is a sharp object. Now your intellect will build off of that senses and it will tell you that because this is a sharp object, I can use it for hunting. But neither your senses nor your intellect can then tell you that although I can use it for hunting, what animals are permissible for me to hunt? How do I hunt them? How do I slaughter them? What parts of the animal can I consume? Right? These are questions that your intellect and your senses don't tell you. For that, then you need wahi. For then you need divine revelation for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to tell you and inform you that these are things that are permissible for you to consume, and here's how you go about consuming that. Okay? When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala send down the wahi, right? This is why we need wahi, because there's a point where your sense and your logic just don't apply anymore. And you need wahi. And when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent down that wahi, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent down the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also sent a prophet along with that wahi. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions a lot of concepts and principles in the Quran at a high level. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam to explain those concepts and rulings. For example, you take a look at zakat. Zakat is mentioned in the Quran more than 24 times. But nowhere in the Quran is it mentioned that this is how you calculate zakat. You have to give 2.5% and such. Right? Those rulings are not explicitly mentioned in the Quran. The Quran contains the fact that we have to give zakat, but then the Prophet ﷺ was sent to then explain what that was. And the Prophet ﷺ did not choose 2.5%, for example, as what he deemed to be most suitable. It wasn't the Prophet ﷺ said that Allah mentions to give zakat, and it seems appropriate that it should be 2.5%, and that it should be calculated in this manner. Right? The Prophet ﷺ did not just decide that from his own. Allah mentions in the Quran, مَا ضَلَّ صَاحِبُكُمْ وَمَا غَوَى وَمَا يَنْطِقُ عَنِ الْهَوَى إِنْ هُوَ إِلَّا وَحْيٌ يُوحَى. That your companion, referring to the Prophet ﷺ, is not gone astray. He doesn't speak from his own. He doesn't speak from his desires. Rather, إِنْ هُوَ إِلَّا وَحْيٌ يُوحَى. Right? Rather, it is a wahi from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That whatever the Prophet ﷺ is saying, it's a wahi from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Just as the Quran is a wahi, just as Quran is wahi, the sunnah and the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ is also wahi. The sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ is also wahi. There's just differences in the form of the wahi. One form of wahi, which is the Quran, is the one that is recited. It is the exact words, these are the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Whereas the other form of wahi, which is the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, it's not recited, okay? And it's what the Prophet ﷺ explained in his words based off of the revelation that was given to him. But they're expressed in his words. But they're both wahi. They're both divine revelation, and they're coming through divine revelation. And the nature of divine revelation, the nature of wahi, is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who reveals it, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who protects it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reveals the wahi, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protects the wahi. We know that when the wahi used to come down on the Prophet ﷺ, the Prophet ﷺ used to try to repeat the verses that were being revealed to him to make sure that he fully memorized and that he had them. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala consoled him and said, لا تحرك به لسانك لتعجل به إن علينا جمعه وقرآنا فإذا قرأناه فاتبع قرآنا ثم إن علينا بيانا. The Prophet, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told the Prophet ﷺ, you don't need to do that. Right? That this is the responsibility that we have taken. إِنَّا نَحْنُ نَزَّلْنَا الذِّكْرَ وَإِنَّا لَهُ لَحَافِظُونَ. We are the one that sends down the wahi, and we are the one that protects it. So we have to understand that the concept of wahi is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who sends it, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then also takes the guarantee to protect it as well. Okay? No Muslim will deny that the Quran that we have today in the current form has changed from the time that it was initially revealed. But no Muslim will accept that, and no Muslim will say that. But the Quran, the one that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to protect, we have to understand that the Quran will be protected both in its words and in its meaning as well. Right? That the Quran is not just going to be such that the words have been preferred, but people have lost the understanding of what does that mean. Everyone still knows that the Quran mentions that you have to give zakat, but the concept of how that zakat should be given has been lost. Right? That doesn't happen. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is taking the responsibility for sending down the wahi and then protecting it as well. Right? And both in its words and its meaning. Right? If the prophetic teachings were not of the Quran were not preserved, despite it being wahi, then we'd be saying that as if one of the purposes of the Prophet ﷺ, which was to send the Prophet ﷺ down in order to convey the message of the wahi, that was to be lost. Okay? The Prophet ﷺ, one of the purposes for which he was sent was to convey that message. Okay? And if we say then the wahi has not been preserved, right, then we're saying that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent down something, promised to safeguard it, and that was not preserved. Okay? The Quran is preserved, and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ is also preserved. And this is something that's important, and we have to understand this, that our ideology is that our religion, our deen, can only be understood and followed properly through wahi. If it could just be understood through intellect, then there wouldn't have been a need for wahi. The wahi came down because intellect wasn't sufficient at that point. So our ideology is that our deen is based on wahi. And that wahi is both the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. It's both, it's not just one or the other. And the false ideology that we see propagated, and I believe Mufti Hussein yesterday in his bayan also referred to it, is this false ideology that we need to now separate the Quran and the Sunnah. That we say, yes, the Quran is preserved, but not the Sunnah. That the Sunnah has not been safeguarded. This is an attempt to destroy our deen and discard wahi under the pretext of safeguarding deen and preserving wahi. It's an attempt to destroy the deen and destroy wahi under the pretext of safeguarding deen and safeguarding wahi, because this is the attack of the Orientalists and the non-Muslims, and unfortunately it's had some impact on some of the Muslims as well, where they say that, under the banner of progressive Islam, that the Quran is preserved, but not the wahi, or sorry, not the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, not the hadith. Right? Some of the feminists and the progressive movements want us to deny the concept of hadith as a man-made, male-oriented science that was unneeded because the Quran was sufficient. And this is an ideology that we completely reject. It's an ideology that's a false ideology that's being spread, and it's one that we completely reject. Right? And their argument and their justification for whatever the agenda they want to push is that, well, it's not in the Quran. That's not mentioned in the Quran. Hadith, we're just going to put it to the side. The fact that it's not in the Quran, then it's okay. And in this process, they've essentially cut out the Prophet ﷺ. They've cut out the Prophet ﷺ from the picture to nothing more than the person who just told us what the verse of the Quran were, and that's it. And this is an ideology that we completely reject. There's not sufficient time to go into sort of the baseless objections that people give towards rejecting hadith and the responses to them. There's not enough time for that. However, we have to understand that the implications of this false ideology are severe. Right? We take the zakat example that was given earlier. We said that zakat is mentioned in the Quran, but it doesn't mention the details of how it must be given and what amount must be given. Right? Now a person, as they're walking out of the masjid, puts a $5 bill in the zakat box and says, the Quran just says give zakat, doesn't say how much. So now I dropped a $1 bill, dropped $5 bills, and with the intention of zakat, and my zakat is done. Or a person, right, we prayed Salatul Dhuhr a little earlier, we're going to pray Salatul Asr. Right? The time for when exactly a salat time enters, when the salat time ends, is not explicitly mentioned in the Quran. Right? We learned that from hadith. And how many rakahs in which salah, that's also not mentioned in the Quran, that's also learned from hadith. Right? If you look at the theme of this retreat in Surah Kahf and the virtues of Surah Kahf, the Quran contains Surah Kahf, it doesn't contain the virtues of Surah Kahf. The Dajjal, Mufti Hussein also mentioned this yesterday, Dajjal is not explicitly mentioned in the Quran. We know Imam Mahdi, whose army will fight the Dajjal, he's not specifically mentioned in the Quran. Isa al-Islam, we know, will come back a second time. Isa al-Islam, we know, will come back down and he'll eventually kill Dajjal, but that's not explicitly mentioned in the Quran. The coming down of Isa al-Islam is not explicitly called out in the Quran. And we can go on with examples of parts of our deen that are completely built off of the Sunnah of the Prophet and the Hadith of the Prophet. And this ideology of Hadith rejection, that we must reject these Hadith, is going to destroy one's deen, because now you have the principles, but you've taken out all the explanations. It has severe implications, and these are the wolves in the sheep's clothing that we're talking about. Right? That without the Hadith, it is easier for a person to then manipulate the Quran and the deen as they want. You can manipulate the Quran as you want then, without the Hadith then. Right? And the tahrif and the distortion that they introduce into the deen is unbelievable. The distortion in the deen that people who then reject Hadith bring into the deen is just unbelievable. I actually had someone justify homosexuality from the Quran. And not just from the Quran, from the story of Lut alayhi salam. Insane, right? And obviously the argument is completely baseless and easy to disprove by anyone. But the point being that once you've taken the Sunnah out of the picture, the distortion that people can try to bring into the deen is just insane. Okay? And if these shayateen, right, these people, their attempts, we have a principle in our deen which is, ma la yudraku kulluhu la yutraku kulluhu, right? That whatever cannot be attained in its entirety, then you don't leave it in its entirety either. Okay? So then, if we can't do something to the best extent, we do whatever we can, right? And these people then use that same principle, and they also apply the same thing, that if we cannot get the Muslims to then reject hadith altogether, they will try to get them to reject a big chunk of the hadith. I will get them to reject a whole chunk of hadith, right? For example, you get them to say that, mashallah, if it's in Bukhari, then you should accept it. If it's in Muslim, then you should accept it. If it's in other books, it's not Bukhari, it's not Muslim. Right? You have to understand the impact here. Right? You have to understand the implications here. Saying that, okay, we accept hadith, right? So we don't say that we reject the hadith. No, we accept hadith. We only accept hadith from this book 1 here and book 2 here, and that's about it. And not only is that just illogical, right? It's just absolutely illogical that 23 years of the Prophet's prophethood, where the Sahaba would record every single thing that the Prophet would say, every single thing that the Prophet would do, every single thing that would happen in the company of the Prophet while he was there, that all of that will be recorded in 2 books. 2 books whose authors themselves say we never try to compile all the hadith. 2 books whose authors themselves say we didn't try to compile all the hadith. Imam Bukhari had a purpose for writing his book. Right? And the official name of Sahih Bukhari, we call it Sahih Bukhari. Imam Bukhari gave it a name, right? And it wasn't Sahih Bukhari, right? Imam Bukhari, he gave it a longer name, and part of that name of the book, right? Al-Jami' al-Sahih al-Musnad al-Mukhtasar min umuri Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam wa iyamihi. One of the words, without going to the full definition of the entire title, it's long, right? One of the words in there is al-Mukhtasar. Right? Even if you don't know Arabic, if you know Urdu, right? What does Mukhtasar mean? Short, summarize, right? Imam Bukhari, rahimahullah, in the title of his own book is saying that he's not trying to compile all the hadith here. In fact, then he also explicitly mentioned clearly that ما أدخلت في كتابي إلا ما صح وتركت من الصحاح لحال الطول. That I didn't enter into my book anything that was authentic, except that it was authentic. But I've left a lot of authentic narrations because the book's just going to get too big. Same thing Imam Muslim rahimahullah as well. He says, لَيْسَ كُلُّ شَيْءٍ عِنْدِي صَحِيحٌ وَضَعْتُهَا هُنَا. That not every hadith that I consider to be authentic have I put it into this book. You have authors who themselves are saying, we're not trying to compile all the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. They had another purpose. Yet, these people with these false ideologies, if they cannot get you to reject all hadith, then they'll get you to reject a massive chunk of hadith. Right? A massive chunk of hadith, if not all hadith. And these are ideologies that we need to be aware of and we need to protect ourselves. We believe in the hadith, we believe in the wahi in all of its form, in the Quran and the Sunnah both. We believe in all the wahi and we believe in all the hadith. Right? Assuming it goes through the authentication process, that's a separate science, but we believe in all the hadith. And now once we've established the need for wahi and defining that the wahi is both the Quran and the Sunnah, and we have understood that the wahi is needed because it discusses a realm in which intellect cannot act, then we also have to then understand that this deen of ours is based on naql, right? And not aql. It's based on naql, transmission of wahi. Right? It's based on transmission. It's not based off of aql, not intellect. The whole purpose of wahi was, again, because of your intellect, doesn't act in that realm. Okay? So our deen is based off of naql, it's based off of narration, it is not based off of aql, it's not based off of your logic. When we have clear teachings of the Prophet ﷺ, then we cannot apply our logic because now you have the realm of wahi and you cannot insert intellect into that. Allah SWT reward the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, whom Allah SWT used for us to use them so that we can learn the implementation of our deen. If you look at the story of the Battle of Uhud, the Prophet ﷺ gave clear command to the Sahaba radiallahu anhum who were on the hill, and he told them clearly that they're not to descend from the hill. إِن رَأَيْتُمُونَا تَخْطَفُنَا الطَّيْرُ فَلَا تَبْرَحُوا مَكَانَكُمْ. Even if you see the birds plucking us, right? Even then you don't come down, you don't leave your position. Right? However, we know the story that once the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, once they saw that the Muslims were victorious, so they thought that the Muslims were victorious and they thought the battle had ended, then they descended down, and we know what happened thereafter. Now these Sahaba radiallahu anhum, they didn't intentionally try to disobey the Prophet ﷺ. These are Sahaba. These are the Sahaba of the Prophet ﷺ. Right? There was a mistake in the approach, right? Where they had the command of the Prophet ﷺ, and then they felt that now that the battle seems to be over, that now that command doesn't apply anymore. Right? Have you heard that logic before? That hadith is there, but it doesn't apply anymore. Right? It doesn't apply to us. Right? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then through that teaches us that logic is not that one we should be adopting. That's not the correct logic. Right? But the same logic is seen nowadays as well. Right? It's a deviant ideology under the false pretext that for following proper Islam, quote unquote, for following proper Islam, we need to reinterpret the Sharia for the 21st century in the West. Right? We need to look at Islam from the perspective of the West in the 21st century and not from the 7th century Arabia. Right? That we need the hadith is there, yes. But now we need to apply our logic and bring our logic into the deen now. Right? That false ideology is one that we absolutely reject. Our deen is based off of wahi, right? We don't understand our deen based off of our intellect, based on what we think is best. Right? We understand our deen based off what Allah SWT mentions is best, and the narration and the wahi of Allah SWT. The modernist approach, right? The modernism, right? The approach that it brings about is that we must understand Islam, which is something that is divine. That we must understand Islam that is divine under the light of logic and science, which is man-made. Right? That's the modernist approach, right? Which is that whatever you're talking about must fit and must apply and must conform within the light of logic and science. And what happens when a person cannot comprehend their Islam in the scope of this logic, in the scope of this philosophy, in the scope of this science, is that now they don't start to doubt the logic and the philosophy and the science. They start to doubt their Islam. Right? Until Allah forbid that person then exits out the fold of Islam. Such a person no longer sees and understands that man is a creation of God. Right? The person starts to think that God is a creation of man. Right? That the God is a man-made concept, a creation. Wal-'iyadhu billah. Right? And these false ideologies, they may seem as like minor notes. They may seem minor, but their implications on a person's faith are massive. Right? Our ideology is that we follow wahi, and we follow without judging it under the light of any other man-made science. Wahi is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent down. It is the absolute truth. Whatever conforms to it, great. Whatever doesn't conform to it, we have a problem with that. We don't have a problem with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We don't have a problem with the wahi itself. Makes sense so far? If it doesn't, raise your hand. Okay, alhamdulillah. Okay. Now that we understand that our deen is based off of wahi, and that wahi being the Quran and the Sunnah both, and we recognize that if this is our wahi, and whatever comes from it is the truth, then we also have to understand and recognize that this wahi also establishes an additional source of understanding rulings within the deen. This wahi establishes another proof in the deen. And that proof is, right, we say our proofs are the Quran, the Sunnah. The third one is ijma', right, consensus. The third one is consensus. Allah mentions, وَمَنْ يُشَاقِقِ الرَّسُولَ مِنْ بَعْدِ مَا تَبَيَّنَ لَهُ الْهُدَى وَيَتَّبِعْ غَيْرَ سَبِيلِ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ نُوَلِّهِ مَا تَوَلَّى وَنُصْلِهِ جَهَنَّمَ وَسَاءَتْ مَصِيرًا. Right? Allah talks about the punishment for those who leave the sabil al-mu'mineen, who go off the path of the believers, and this here referring to ijma', referring to the consensus of the believers. Once a person came to Imam Shafi'i rahimahullah and says, what's the proof of ijma' from the Quran? And Imam Shafi'i said, I'll look it up and I'll tell you. And Imam Shafi'i got back to that person 3 days later, and then he told him that this ayah is the proof for ijma' in the Quran. And then later on he told some of his companions that he didn't have this knowledge beforehand, so he had to read the Quran 3 times daily for 3 days before he realized that this is the verse that proves that ijma' is being proven from this ayah. So we know this is the ayah that proves ijma'. Now ijma', consensus, could not logically and practically be consensus of every single Muslim living on earth. Right? It just cannot be the case. It just logically and practically cannot happen. So if it's not going to be of every single Muslim that exists on the earth, then we know and we can understand that it's going to be of those who are experts in the Islamic sciences. Right? It's going to be from amongst a group of believers, not all believers, not every single Muslim on this earth. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in the Quran, وَمَا كَانَ الْمُؤْمِنُونَ لِيَنْفِرُوا كَافَّةً فَلَوْلَا نَفَرَ مِنْ كُلِّ فِرْقَةٍ مِّنْهُمْ طَائِفَةٌ لِيَتَفَقَّهُوا فِي الدِّينِ وَلْيُنذِرُوا قَوْمَهُمْ إِذَا رَجَعُوا إِلَيْهِمْ لَعَلَّهُمْ يَحْذَرُونَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about that all believers should not just go out in one direction. There must be a group of people, right? There must be a group of people who are then dedicated towards getting tafaqquh fi din, to getting deep understanding of the deen. And the important thing here is it mentions طَائِفَةٌ لِيَتَفَقَّهُوا فِي الدِّينِ, a group of people who will then get that deep understanding of deen. There's responsibilities being given to a group, not to the entire Muslim base. That there's going to be a group of people who will then become experts in the deen, and their job will be then to teach and warn other believers. But that's what's established from this ayah. And what that establishes also is that we have authorities in the matters of religious understanding. And we have authorities in the matters of deduction of rulings. Right? If you didn't have an authority and if you just everyone could do it, then what's the point of having a group that Allah says, what's the point of Allah mentioning there must be a group who gets deeper understanding if that responsibility could be for everyone? Right? The fact that Allah is saying there must be a group who gets that deeper understanding means that there must be a group that has authority in the matters of religion. Right? And you establish authority in religion through that. And then you have فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنْتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. Right? Those people who have reached that level of expertise, great. If you haven't reached that level of expertise, then ask the people who are then the experts. Right? And there's the false ideology that comes from postmodernism. There's a postmodernist ideology that we must disregard all authority. Okay? This is the postmodernist ideology, right? That we don't want authority, neither from the religious scholars, neither from the science experts. That there's no authority. Everyone's an authority, right? Everyone's an expert. Okay? And everyone should act in accordance with their understanding. Right? And then you have people argue about, when I read the Quran, this is what the Quran tells me. But that's what the Quran tells me. Right? Well, the Quran says something, and make sure that if it tells you something, it conforms to what everyone else has understood as well. Right? And this is now done, and you have to understand, this is the whole concept of the sheep's in the wolf's clothing, or the wolves in the sheep's clothing. Right? That's not just an outright attack on Islam, because then you see, okay, this person is trying to attack Islam, and you automatically become defensive. It's trying to bring that attack from within. Okay? And this is done, right? This false ideology that we must reject all authority is then done under false pretext of arguments like, the Quran is for everyone. And, we don't have a hierarchical clergy system within Islam. If you want to cut the Muslims off from understanding their deen, if you want to cut the Muslims off from understanding their Islam, then what do? You cut them off from the people who will then explain it to them. If you don't want Muslims to understand Islam, cut them off from the people who will explain Islam to them. And this is exactly what this ideology proposes, right? That everyone, you look at your own, and there's no concept of authority. It's whatever it tells you, right? Yes, the Quran is for everyone. The Quran is for everyone, but it does not mean that every single person has the same level of expertise to derive the rulings therefrom. Otherwise, as we talked about, what's the purpose of the ayah then? Right? And yes, we don't have a hierarchical clergy system like in Christianity or such. We don't have bishops and pope and such. But at the same time, we have naturally experts in every field. That's a logical matter. You have experts in every field, and then you have experts in the field of Islam as well. And when people disregard the explanations of the deen from those who are in authority within the deen, then you have the mass distortion of the true nature of the deen. And everyone starts to give their own unqualified understanding of what Islam says and what the interpretation of the Quran and the Sunnah would be. Right? And then this is the result. The result that comes out from this is, as Ali radiallahu anhu mentioned, that kalimatul haqq urida biha al-batil. It's kalimatul haqq urida biha al-batil. This is, you use something that is haqq, something that is true. Right? You say, this is what the Quran says, this is what the hadith says, right? But then that is haqq, that Quran is haqq, the verse is true, the hadith is true. But the interpretation and what you're trying to derive from that distortion, that is batil, right? That is falsehood. And this is what Ali radiallahu anhu warned, kalimatul haqq urida bihal batil. Use true statements, but you drive absolute falsehood therefrom. Now, the results that we see from this, where every person has gone and interpreted their own religion, you have weird opinions that people develop, the extremism that we see, because these are the people who then reject everything that everyone else has said and just look at this is what we think the Quran is then saying. And you also then have this lead to the perennial philosophy that and the fitna that is related to that, where some Muslims have kind of adopted that into that all religions are variations of the truth, right? All religions are just variations of the truth, and at the end of the day, all are fine, right? You follow Christianity, you follow Judaism, you follow whatever, they're all reflections of the truth, and whatever you follow, then it's all okay. Right? And there's severe implications of that. There's serious implications of Iman and the lack of Iman. For a person to believe that the Islam is a true deen versus a person to say, whatever you follow at the end of the day, it's all good and it's all fine anyway. Right? There's serious implications that come about first from when you then remove that authority and then remove that expertise from within the field of Islam as well. Okay? Now, given all these false ideologies, we have a few responsibilities. We have a few responsibilities that we need to be mindful of. First is that we must understand what our ideology is. We must first and foremost understand our own ideology, that we follow the Quran and Sunnah both. Okay? That we base rulings on narration, not based off of our logic and our intellect. That we recognize and follow the teachings of those who are experts within the field. Okay? These are things that we must first understand our own ideology. That's number one. The second is we must be cognizant of the fitna and the false ideologies out there, so that we do not fall prey and do not be fooled by the attractive slogans and the outward appearance of such movements and such ideologies, right? The wolves within the sheep's clothing. Third, we must know that the end result of any of these false ideologies is that they will perish. They're going to perish. Okay? قُلْ جَاءَ الْحَقُّ وَزَهَقَ الْبَاطِلِ إِنَّ الْبَاطِلَ كَانَ زَهُوقًا. Okay? The truth has come, the haqq has come, the falsehood is going to perish. Okay? The important thing is to be aware is whether in that process we get afflicted by that false ideology as well. Whether we fall prey to that falsehood before it is destroyed. Okay? And that's number 4, which is that we must adopt the solution to safeguard ourselves from false ideologies. Okay? Allah Ta'ala does not want us to follow these people with these false ideologies. Allah Ta'ala mentions, وَلَا تُطِعْ مَنْ أَغْفَلْنَا قَلْبَهُ عَنْ ذِكْرِنَا وَاتَّبَعَ هَوَاهُ وَكَانَ أَمْرُهُ فُرُطًا in Surah Kahf, in verse number 28. That do not follow the way of these people who are unmindful about our remembrance, and they're just following their desires. That do not follow them. But then we look at, well, how do we make sure that we don't end up following them? The solution to that is in that same ayah, earlier in the ayah. Allah SWT mentions, وَاصْبِرْ نَفْسَكَ مَعَ الَّذِينَ يَدْعُونَ رَبَّهُمْ بِالْغَدَاةِ وَالْعَشِيِّ يُرِيدُونَ وَجْهَهُ وَلَا تَعْدُ عَيْنَاكَ عَنْهُمْ تُرِيدُ زِينَةَ الْحَيَاةِ الدُّنْيَا. Allah SWT mentions that the way that we must safeguard ourselves from these false ideologies is that we must keep the companionship of the pious, of those people who remember Allah SWT morning and night. Right? And they don't want anything else except the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That these are the people whose companionship that we need to keep in order to safeguard ourselves from all these false ideologies. And one of the most problematic ideas that has crept into the minds of Muslims, students of knowledge included, is that the concept of ilm and the concept of tazkiyah and spiritual rectification, that these are two separate fields, individual of one another, independent of one another. Right? Which is something that's absolutely untrue and completely contradictory to the practice of our pious predecessors. Our pious predecessors would embed themselves in the company of a scholar in order to learn his character, in order to learn his worship, in order to learn his manners, before they would engage in learning any fiqh or hadith from them. When Imam Malik rahimahullah was a young boy, when he was a young boy and he expressed his desire to go learn the deen, his mother prepared him to go and learn, and then she gave him the advice before she sent him off. She said, now go to Rabi'a, right, whom Imam Malik was going to learn from. He said, go to Rabi'a, but learn his good character and conduct before you begin to learn the knowledge that he dispenses. Right? Before you learn the knowledge that he dispenses, first go and learn his conduct and his character. Okay? These two things always went together. If you look at our lineage of scholarship, they're always combined. They always combine education and companionship together. They always combine education and spiritual rectification together. Right? Hafiz Faraz in the introduction mentioned that I studied under Mufti Ibrahim Desai, who many of you know from an academic perspective of askimam.org. Okay? But just as he's into the academics, he's very much into the spiritual as well. Right? If you look at his teacher, was the Grand Mufti of India, Mufti Mahmud Hassan Gangohi rahimahullah, same thing. Maybe he may have been a Grand Mufti of India, but at the same time he's a very spiritual person. If you look at his teacher, Shaykh Zakaria, Hazrat Shaykh Zakaria rahimahullah, right, a lot of people know him from Fadail al-A'mal, but he's got a lot more academic works as well. He was an expert in the field of hadith, but also very much into the field of tazkiyah. If you look at his teacher, Ma Khalil Ahmad Saharanpuri rahimahullah, right, look at his explanation of Abu Dawood, it's amazing. Right? He had the ilm, but the tazkiyah was there together. The spiritual purification and mind, the concern about the cleanliness of the heart was always there together with that. If you look at his teacher, Mufti Rashid Ahmad Gangohi rahimahullah, right, who people would say this is like another Imam Abu Hanifa here. Right? Same thing, his knowledge was there, then his spiritual companionship was there as well. And you could trace this all the way back. Right? We mentioned the story of Imam Malik, you can trace this all the way back to our entire lineage of scholarship. Those two things always went together. They were never separate tracks. Right? And there's a reason why in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best, but it seems to us that there's a wisdom why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions this ayah, وَيْجَادُ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا بِالْبَاطِلِ لِيُضْحِدُوا بِهِ الْحَقِّ. Right? That those who disbelieve, they argue with falsehood in order to remove the truth. Right? In order to remove and reject and rebut the truth. Right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions this ayah, and then thereafter comes the story of Musa alayhi salam going and having companionship with Khidr and learning from him. Right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best, but it seems to us that perhaps there's a hikmah here and there's an indication here. Right? And we need to bridge, as a way of preventing ourselves, we need to bridge these two tracks back together. That in order to safeguard ourselves and our families from all these false ideologies, that we have to do some of the things that we mentioned, but we also have to then keep that pious companionship, right? That concept of the kahf, that concept of the cave that has been mentioned before. Right? That place and those people with whom you keep company to make sure that you are on the right track, that concept has to be there. Our ilm and our spiritual rectification need to be together. They cannot be separate. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for protection of our iman and for protection from all the false ideologies out there. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He uses in a way that is pleasing to Him, and that He allows us to live in a way that is pleasing to Him, and that He allows us to pass on the true deen of Islam. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.